We also have to re-examine many of the old attitudes, including the tendency to look for the cost side of state expenditure without paying enough attention to the benefits from those expenditures. This is not to say that we can go on increasing state-run deficits as if they do not matter. They do, of course, matter. But there is a need for balance on thinking about this question as well. First, we have to balance the problems created by deficits against the problems that would be created by sudden decrease in public expenditure. Certain types of public expenditures are easier to prune than others without any terrible effects on the lives of human beings. And there is clearly need for critical scrutiny as to which these are. What this requires is a discriminating attitude rather than a general presumption in favor of cutting as much public expenditure as possible and cutting them according to which is the easiest to cut rather than which would be the best to cut, taking into account their comparative contribution compared with the other types of expenditure. Second, the seriousness of a deficit is much greater, and this is an important economic problem to recognize, much greater when an economy is declining or stagnant than when the economy is growing fast and generating new resources constantly. To some extent, even America has had less problem than Europe, precisely because even now America is growing faster than Europe. And even poor economies like mine, India, despite having a very huge deficit as a percentage of GDP, a very high percentage, you don't see the kind of crisis at all, mainly because the economy is growing at 7 or 8%. At that level of growth, it isn't the problem. This is a very important point to recognize. In fact, coming back to Adam Smith, he saw the task of political economy, and here Adam Smith is discussing the definition of economics. And he says, political economy has two distinct objects. I quote from Smith. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, this is important for the capability perspective, to enable them to provide such revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services. Unquote. These are the two goals of economics as Smith sees them. When expenditure cutting with great severity is likely to produce a sharp restraint on or reduction of economic growth, the well-meaning policies of economic frugality can be quite counterproductive. Clear economic thinking requires us to pay attention, as Adam Smith argued, to the likely impact of the proposed policies on the revenue generated for the state and on the ability of the state to continue to provide the necessary public services. I might give some numbers here, looking at some Indian figures, that when the economy grows at 6, 7, 8%, the public revenue grows at 10, 11, 12%, because it's much more concentrated on the borrowing sector, from which you collect more taxes and you can get more revenue. So this is a very important connection again to look at. There's need for some reflection here on things happening in the world right now. There is, for example, the ongoing Greek economic crisis. There have been certainly many mistakes on economic policy making in Greece over a number of years. But the crisis was also substantially generated by a collapse of financial confidence in the Greek economy. Given the nature of the market economy, this kind of collapse can generate a huge vicious circle. The lack of confidence generates a credit squeeze, and the Greek bonds were sharply downgraded by all-powerful rating agencies. One of them downgraded it to junk, thereby making Greeks' problem much, much worse, since Greeks now found it more difficult to borrow from abroad and had to pay a much higher interest rate. the talk of the necessity of serious pain to be felt by the Greeks, and I read it in the papers again and again, before we give support, the Greeks have to understand and feel the pain. There was a kind of stern schoolmaster attitude coming from the more affluent European economists, lecturing the Greeks on the great pedagogic importance of pain. I think they made things for a while worse and worse, making the needed rescue package bigger and bigger. Ultimately, it actually hit the countries which had to bail out Greece, because the rescue package was much larger, and even that is not clearly working, than it would have been if intervention came sharply, rather than giving lectures at that time on the pedagogic value of pain. Greek policies of the past could certainly be substantially blamed and need rectification for what's happening in Greece. But the rest of the world did not make things easier for Greece. Indeed, for a while, the disciplinarian talk and significant delays in providing help added to the severity of the problem rather than subtracting from it. The rescue package, I've already said that ultimately came, had to be much larger as a result. So I can skip that sentence. And Greece now has to cope with a consequently larger burden of debt. It's not only those who get the money, but that's the debt burden for the Greeks to overcome. It's often suggested these days that what we need is a new kind of capitalism. Is that the right way of thinking about our problems today? One difficulty in talking about new capitalism is that it is not altogether clear what the essential requirements are for an economy to count as capitalist. If the present economic system is to be reformed, what would make the reformed system a new capitalism rather than a new something else? What are the special characteristics, the presence of which makes the system indubitably capitalist, old or new? If we look at the textbooks, it's clear that relying on the markets for economic transactions is meant to be something like a necessary qualification for an economy to be seen as capitalist. And in a similar way, dependence on the profit motive and on individual entitlements based on private ownership are seen as archetypal features of capitalism. However, if these are necessary requirements of capitalism, are the economic systems we currently have, for example, in Europe and America and parts of Asia, genuinely capitalist? All affluent countries in the world, those in Europe as well as in USA, Canada, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Australia and others, have depended for quite some time now on transactions that occur largely outside the market, such as unemployment benefits, public pensions, other features of social security, the provision of school education, in most countries healthcare, and a variety of other services distributed through non-market arrangements. The economic entitlements connected with these transactions are not based on private ownership and property rights. And the market economy has depended for its own working not only on profit maximization, but also on many other motivations, some of which have restrained and modified the unrestricted search for profit. The creditable performance of the alleged capitalist system in the days when things moved forward rather than backward drew on a combination of institutions, and this is important to recognize when one says the glorious decades of capitalism. It's a glorious decade of a very mixed system. The combination of institutions that went much beyond relying only on profit-maximizing market economy and on personal entitlement confined to private ownership.